So today we are using Zoom meetings for this discussion. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Or actually type your name into the chat because I may not be able to see everyone's hands raised in their through all the Zoom screens. So just put your name in the chat at any point saying, I have a question, and then I'll make up a queue that just says kind of has the sort of order of questions. And then when your turn is up, I'll just call upon you and you can unmute yourself and give your question, or if you want read, you can type it out. To ensure the best quality for our discussion, I'd ask that if you are not speaking to please mute your microphone. So with all of that, for today's seminar, we're very pleased to welcome Ian McCallum, who will be discussing his research project, Asiiskusiipuw, which regarding Munsee language revitalization, and his research on the role of rivers that are important to Munsee history and language. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ian, who will tell us a little bit about himself and then begin his presentation. So welcome, Ian.
Anishik, Brian, Anishik for that introduction as well. I'd like to extend a thank you to the team at APS for the invitation to come and share this research. I'm going to introduce myself in the Munsee language, and I'll translate into English right after that. So, Kolomalsimwa, Nidashinzi Wabanachgo Ninonjai Nalahi, Shuknuikian Berry, Nawalotman Mundak Fwa, Nindalok Sheshko Halawasik Pambilak, Aneshik Washapawewak, Ninjikaning Wak Chimnasing Nina Winwaswi. So in the Munsee language, I introduced myself. It's how are you all feeling? I can't see everybody. I was stuck there whether I was going to use Kwinganao Waloma, which is it's good to see you, but I can't see all 44 people. So I had to use something else. But my name is Wabanachka. I'm of the people. My English name is Ian McCallum. My mother is from Munsee, Delaware. My dad is an English immigrant to Canada. I follow the ways of my mom's clan, which is the Turtle Clan. In my normal 9-to-5 job, I work as an education officer for the Ministry of Education here in Ontario, and I work in the Indigenous Education Office, so I support school boards. That's the only way I could say it in Munsee was I work with a lot of school papers. I also had to do my own land acknowledgement in that actually I'm not on Munsee territory because I live north of Toronto. I'm actually on someone else's territory, which is the Ojibwe people of Rama and Christian Island. So I live just outside of a town called Barrie. But I have to acknowledge as a visitor on the lands of the Chippewa and Wadawa and the Potawatomi that I too am a visitor and I need to offer that land acknowledgement. I'd like to share with you some of the research that is currently going on from my community regarding the Thames River. So Asiiskusiipuw in Munsee language means muddy river, and there's probably no better word to describe what the Thames River actually looks like because it tends to travel through a clay belt, and it's always you can't see the bottom, so it's always muddy. Oops, went too far. So the Munsee language revitalization project involving the Thames River is multi-year. It doesn't really have an end date. This was sort of hatched during the pandemic as a way where we could do research in a safe manner. And the river is a good place to get away from people if you need that distance. Some of the questions that were raised from a community standpoint, I should make sure that's clear. This isn't actually part of my thesis work for the University of Toronto. This is actually grassroots from the community. So these are questions that were raised by a group of people who are involved with history, language, and culture as to how the river might support their work. So how can story, geography, environment, and built structure support the revitalization of the Munsee language? What aspects of culture and history can be rediscovered with the Thames River as the catalyst? And then can we use this model that we're using with the Thames River and actually apply that to other water routes that are important to the Munsee people? A little primer in terms of the community itself. We're located, our reserve is located in southwestern Ontario on the Thames River. We've been there since about 1780. So the majority of us crossed over the Niagara River just at the end of the War of Independence. We weren't supposed to. I think the British wanted a sort of an orderly approach to settling what was known as Quebec at the time, but turned into Ontario. But we crossed over and we continued on our way from Six Nations, where you initially settled, and went westward to live with the Chippewa people on the Thames River. The community itself is actually located within the Chippewa, the Thames territory. So it's like a postage stamp on a letter. Our reserve is the postage stamp, and the Chippewa, the Thames is actually the letter. So we don't have a whole lot of land, and we're landlocked by the Chippewa community as well. Across the river is the Oneida Nation of the Thames. They arrived in 1840 from Upper New York State. So there's actually 3 different languages that are spoken on the Thames River, indigenous languages, that being Chippewa, Munsee, and Oneida in a very small geographic area, as well as our 2 official languages, official in quotation, here in Canada, which is English and French. So there's 5 different languages within a very small geographic area, which makes it kind of like its own mini Europe, if you will. Population of my community is about 700 total. About 550 people live off reserve, and that includes myself and my family. At this point, we only have second language speakers. So there are no first language speakers. The last one passed in the very early 1990s. We have access to large urban centers. London's 30 minutes to the east. Detroit's 3 hours to the west, and Toronto is 2 hours to the east as well. So most of the people who live on the community are Red Wings fans, but I won't hold that against them. We do have service. We have internet service, which has been recently it's extended. So most people now have a reliable internet service. And most of our social services revolve around our daycare, healthcare, and administration. And as I said before, I'm part of a larger group of people. Mostly they're my relatives, to be honest with you, my sister, my cousins. We're all interested in trying to find these pieces of web of story, of history, of language, of culture that is spread all over the place. And I use the analogy that our ancestors left clues, and the clues are within the language, the story, and the environment, where we as the next generation now have to put those pieces back together. And what we're very interested in doing is we're trying to, when we come up with resources, we share with the community, but we're also trying to find the best way possible to share that information, not only with our community, other Indigenous communities, and the general public at large. Geographical context for the Thames River, it starts just to the east of London, Ontario. There are 3 branches that sort of make up the Thames River. 2 of those branches connect right in downtown London, and the river continues on and empties into Lake St. Clair. It's very flat land, mostly really good farmland. The surprising thing on our canoe trip is I haven't found a whole lot of large rivers that come into the Thames. There are mostly little streams, little creeks, but nothing major. So most of the water that I think that the Thames get comes from its tributaries and its source points further to the east of London. The historical maps of the Thames also provide a lot of information when you're canoeing, because of course the river hasn't changed course much, which is highly surprising because the Thames used to flood a lot, and you'd figure you'd get some geographical patterns of the river that would change over time. But there's a place where we're stopped actually currently on our canoe trip called Big Bend. And it's this massive bend in the river, and it appears on the 1795 Patrick McNiff survey. And of course, there it does still exist here in 2023 as our next starting point before we make our way further down towards Lake St. Clair. The river has provided a lot of different connections through the research so far. And this is sort of a mind map of things that provide sort of the context, but also the boundaries to make this research viable. The first being, it's allowed us to understand those seasonal places in which the Munsee people would have gone here in southwestern Ontario. So they would have had a main village, but they also had other villages that they used temporarily for, let's say right now, which is maple sugaring here in Ontario, but also for fishing or for hunting they had different places that they would go. So taking a deep dive into understanding the river has allowed us to understand how our people moved around. It provided a wealth of literacy resources for our language learners as well. Story. Apparently there's a mermaid that lives in the Thames River. That was the last word that I ever expected to appear in our dictionary, but there's a story there. And the story may not belong to my community, but it may also belong to the community that's further down the Thames River at Moraviantown. So that's a piece that can also support some understanding with the language. Our religion, our big house religion, was last practiced in 1840. There's connections with the river and ceremonies within the big house. Another piece that has happened through the river research is place name. So we've been able to identify what the Munsee people called points of interest or important points along the river, but also in southwestern Ontario, stretching all the way to the Niagara River. We've also documented the plants, the tree species, the fish, animals, amphibians, insects as much as we can, and we've tried to figure out if it's missing in our current dictionary, then can we find it somewhere else? So that gives you a sort of perspective from the eyes of the river. As I said before, it flows through a lot of farmland. So on either side of the river, it tends to be fairly flat, like nice flat plains that lead right up to the river. But you go through large amounts of the river where you would think that you're in a very secluded spot in Ontario, that you were in northern Ontario where not very many people live, that on either side of you, if you landed your canoe, you wouldn't find anything of civilization whatsoever. So as much as you're traveling through a very populated part of our province, you get that sense that it's still, you got that wild aspect to it. And along the banks, if they're not flat banks, then you've got these nice high clay cliffs. And these clay cliffs are just outside the Oneida Nation of the Thames. So it's not, at first glance, it seems like a really boring river to paddle. But in reality, there's lots of different changes to it. You get some white water, which was unexpected, and you have to pull your canoe and hop out and carry it through the rocks. But there's lots of interesting things. And so the whole mindset when you're going down there is, am I coming past something that was important that my people would have used, or that they would have stopped here? Is this like, would this have been a fish fence? Would this have been a good place for hunting? So that whole mindset you're trying to get your brain into while you're paddling and looking around going, would this have helped our people in a certain way? So the first part that I'll offer in terms of making some specific connections will be this building. And this is the oldest building that is from our community, the built structure. This was built in the 1840s or 50s by my great grandfather, Abraham Huff. So this building was, it housed 3 generations of my family. Within that, there's lots of story, there's lots of conversation going on. And of course, it happened not in the English language, so it happened in the Munsee language. So one particular event that happened within this building happened sometime in the 1840s or very early 1850s. And it was a bunch of warriors from the War of 1812 came by to talk to my great grandfather. And my one of my relatives, Jacob Logan, Jacob overheard them talking, and the warriors talked about where Tecumseh finally died and where he is buried. And if you're at all familiar with Southwestern Ontario, any War of 1812 history, it's one of those, 20th wonders of the world. Where is Tecumseh buried? It's one of those mysteries. And Jacob, before he passed in 1932, he related the story to the London Free Press. So he told a story detailing what he overheard in this building. And there's sort of this, I don't know if it's an unwritten rule within the Logan family or whether it's within Indigenous stories as a whole. But as a kid growing up on the reserve, my great grandfather would say, "Oh, we know where Tecumseh's buried." I said, "Oh, that's an exciting story," because I loved history as a kid. I still do. But and I said, "So where's he buried? Will you take me there?" He goes, "No, I can't tell you." So there's always that can't tell you. They tell a great story, but they will never give away the ending. And that was true with what Jacob told the London Free Press. So what I did was I went hunting for that article, found the article, and it's fairly lengthy. And over the last couple of years of COVID, I translated the story into the Munsee language. And my artist friend, Catherine, she provided the artwork for the story. So the next slide actually gives you an indication of what the translation looks like. So on the bottom part is the actual English straight from the article in the London Free Press. And then you have the fulsome Munsee translation above. And we shared this with at Princeton last year as part of our storytelling evening. So certain times in the season, or sorry, in the year, you can actually tell stories. And we told this story in February. True to nature, it doesn't tell you where Tecumseh's buried, but it's a piece that now supports our intermediate language learners. It also is a story that was told by one of our elders of our community, has now been translated back into the language that he actually spoke. So it's kind of like, it's not like righting wrongs, but we're doing the respect of the story by not giving things away, but we're also translating it back into the language in which it was heard. There's also a collection of hymnals that are from our community that were created in 1842 by Charles Half Moon. And they're just a translation of the Anglican hymnary. I have not had a great opportunity to look at these yet, simply because they're written in a different sort of phonetics, so they're hard to follow at times. And I have 202 other jobs currently, so this is a piece that's on the shelf that is there waiting, but it's also part of, how can language support our community? More contemporary sense, out of the river journey, there came two books. One's finished and one's not. Asiiskusiipuw, Wichkuneum and Siwak is a completed text, and it is used for our language learners. Asiiskusiipuw is more of a historical documentation of how the Munsee people used the river in the past, including the War of 1812 or the War of Independence. Those pieces are going to belong in that text. And this is sort of the interior of the Asiiskusiipuw Munsee-Siwak book, where it's fully illustrated. We focused on full sentences because it was designed for intermediate speakers, and it just details parts of our canoe trip, including the sore backs, or getting out for lunch, or it was a wonderful day. And it also details of things that we saw, so including the plants, the fish, and the bird species that happen along the way. We had a beaver, tour in front of us, muskrat tour in front of us. We had Canadian geese that wouldn't get out of the way. All of that appears within the book so that our learners get both a balance of learning some nouns, but also building their sentences together. It's sort of it's a detour off of our other work that we've done in that it's not written with phonetics inside. Oftentimes with languages that are very endangered and don't have a lot of speakers, a lot of resources will have phonetics to support the language learning. And this was designed to sort of push the limits of our language learners. So it only appears in Munsee and English. While I was at Princeton, I like to run. That's exercise that I picked up when my kids were very young. I could go for a quick run and be back, and that way I could help out with raising kids and putting them in for their naps and all sorts of things. But I tripped over an Osage orange, and I have never seen an Osage orange prior to that. So this was a catalyst for understanding what I'm missing in terms of the environment in which Munsee people, where they used to live, right? So Lenapehoking in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York, I'm missing out on a whole range of plants, trees, and species that I don't know. And the Osage orange was one of them. While I haven't found a word for Osage orange, it was the catalyst for trying to figure out, not only are the plant species going to change between where the community is now to New Jersey, there may be some similarities, but there's going to be words that just didn't make it into our dictionary. So in building out the natural, I'm going to call it the natural dictionary, the natural environment dictionary, the first job was to take a look at our contemporary dictionary, which is the dictionary created by John O'Meara in the very early 1990s. However, it's not comprehensive. It doesn't have everything. So therefore, then what I've done is I've gone to different places to try and find those trees, plants names that I can't find through asking in community. And that's helpful in the case that they may tell you that they'll tell you the word in English, but now I can go back and translate that into Munsee, or I can find a way around that to come up with that translation. The works of J.P. Harrington and Frank Speck that have been so, I know Brian that has been so helpful in terms of helping me with that. The interviews that were completed at Six Nations in the 1930s have been very helpful because they interviewed the Delaware community there. So there's been missing pieces that have come from that. There's also a dictionary that's been created by Miles Beckwith and Ives Goddard, who've studied the Lenape language, the Delaware language for quite some time, that have the words that just maybe didn't make it into a contemporary dictionary, which has been another valuable source of finding information. And then the map work in missionary journals also, can't be discounted. The work of David Zeisberger and John Hackwelder have also helped in terms of finding at least some clues, right, in terms of those trees and plants that I'm trying to identify. So this sort of gives a window into sort of how I do the research. And I've done the research in conjunction with some colleagues at the IAS, Susan Akbari and Melissa Morton. But here's the word for American chestnut. This word appears in our dictionary. So Wapamingi is the word for that tree. You'll notice that in the David Zeisberger dictionary, it's very close, right? So we wanted to draw attention to the fact that this had been recorded previous, but there's also those further definitions that you get from other books, such as, I think it's Gladys Tetquidgen book that was done in the 1930s from the University of Pennsylvania. It's Delaware Medicinal Practices, I believe, but it also appears in there where you get a little bit more information, such as it's called the big acorn tree. So we wanted to make sure that we captured all of this. If when we go back, we take a look at the word wapim minji, what does wapim mean? Right? Is there connections between acorn and wapim, right? So that it gives that fulsome view of research. And with the help of an artist named Aurelia Morton Gottwals, she's actually creating or helping me to create the field guide. So the goal is to have a talking field guide of trees and plants, with the goal that this can be used not only for sort of conservation areas located in southwestern Ontario, it can be used by institutions, but also our K-12 programming and post-secondary. So our students would have access to this as well, because most of them don't learn, they don't attend school on the reserve. We don't have a school. So this can support their learning in a school board sense. So Wapamingi, she's done the artwork for this, and we're going to provide the audio with each clip as well, so the students can hear the words, or for those that are interested in the language can hear the words. And there's the word for sycamore, amohawa. And that's where the tree gives it away, the word gives it away. So amahol is the word for boat in the Munsee language. So you have a clue to actually what this tree was used for. And we have sycamore trees here in Ontario. They only grow along the Thames towards the Lake Erie shoreline in an environment called what's called the Carolinian zone. So we get a lot of trees and plants that would only appear in the southern United States, just because the climate is such, because of the Great Lakes. It's provide that microclimate. So we get sycamores. Where I live up in north of Toronto, there's never been a sycamore here because they don't like the weather that we have. But they really do thrive along the Thames River. I mean, there's huge ones, and you can see how the people would have wanted this tree to hollow out and make their boat. Shindok is one of our 4 medicines. It grows quite well up here north of Toronto, but it's also quite apparent along the Thames River as well. So those are some of the examples of the trees that have been created so far for our guide. There's quite a long list of plants and trees that we have. And then there's, I don't know, There's probably at least 20 that still need to be worked through in terms of a translation, or an old word needs to be translated into the modern form for students to learn. Wakanao is the dogwood. And I shared this earlier with another group. I still don't know if this is actually what the tree's called, because Wakanao is dog in Munsee language. It seems a little too easy, the translation. So there might be another word out there to describe the dogwood, but I haven't found it yet. When I do, I'll add that in as well. We have created, with the support of a group called Learning Bird here in Canada, to actually create language videos. And this is all part because the capacity of our community is such that you have to reach out and tap others. Sadly, we don't have enough second language speakers to do all the work necessary that our community asks for, or that other organizations ask for. So I'm getting better at what's it called? I think it's delegating. So I've reached out to Learning Bird. They have supported me in creating 3 videos. 2 are my voice. Sorry, 1 is my voice actually detailing the plants and the trees. So that's available for our K-12 students. I've had support from a colleague who speaks the language. She's helped me with an introductions video, and also with the animals video. So she's done this one. So what we've tried to do is we've taken our elements of the Thames River tour, and we've now put them into video form to support our daycare, our students who go from kindergarten all the way to grade 12, but also our adult learners. So if they would like to learn on their own time, there's a wealth of information they can access. The map work that I alluded to right at the beginning is important for language, because it does tell you where people used to do different practices within our community. So in this map, it actually details where our cornfields were. So you'll notice on the far right top corner, there's a series of darkened patches, and that tells you where the cornfields were for our community. And it's important because it's corroborated by not missionary journals from Raventown. So Zeisberger detailed the fact that in the very early years of the settlement at Raventown of Fairfield, it's actually the Munsee people in my community that helped them stay alive, because they didn't have enough corn. They didn't have enough time to plant their cornfields when they arrived, so they had to get corn from us. As well, there's documentation of people from Munsee trading corn, animals, and maple sugar with the fort in Detroit, because the British still sort of hung on to Detroit after the War of Independence. So it's important to understand here from a horticultural standpoint is to where our cornfields were, and then again, how the people used the river to access those cornfields, because that bend in the river is actually, it takes you about an hour to paddle. Doesn't seem like a lot, but because it's got so many bends in it, you think you're home and then you're not home. And so this map is really important for that work, making connections to traditional horticulture, how the river was used, and then as well, it makes those connections with languages. This is an exciting piece that I want to talk about. It's acknowledging place in the Munsee language, and going back to the fact that my people have been in Ontario for maybe about 240 years. 240, my math's terrible. 240 years, right? So there's not a lot of opportunity you would think that place name would not exist. And certainly if you open up a road map of Ontario, you're not going to get any sense that Munsee people have been there that long. Now, the great part is that through dictionaries and through historical sources, we found that the Munsee had lots of names for different places. And I mean, one of the things was that if Detroit was so important to the Munsee people, why is there no name for Detroit in the language? I didn't overhear anybody say it when I was a kid. but there has to be something that had been recorded. So if you've ever, and if you know Ontario, there's a city on Lake Ontario called Hamilton. And Hamilton is built, well, Hamilton traditionally was built down on the shores of Lake Ontario, but Hamilton has kind of gone up on top of the Niagara escarpment. The escarpment provides in the Niagara Falls. But the Munsee people called Hamilton Alamawang, which means down under the hill. So those people that lived with the Six Nations called Hamilton, which is about 30 to 40 minutes away from the reserve at Six Nations, they called Hamilton Alamawang. So this is a partnership with Western University, excuse me, and I don't have any GIS knowledge. So Liz Sutherland, who works with Western University, has been very helpful in supporting me understand how GIS technology can be used to map out the Munsee place names. And this map sort of gives you an idea of southwestern Ontario, where you figure a lot of places are going to show up along the Thames River, so that from London all the way to Detroit, there's quite a high concentration of place names we found. You'll also notice that from Hamilton and Brantford all the way down to Lake Erie, there's place names, which is the Grand River, where other Delaware people settled. And then moving sort of east towards St. Catharines and Buffalo, that's expected as well, because our people have spent time there either as refugees from the war, or they in turn settled, or those were important places where they actually went to work in the 1800s. Again, it's a similar research process. So if it's not in the Delaware Dictionary, I've gone to community recollections and community common names. Again, the research found in the APS was wonderful for this, that those are the interviews conducted at Six Nations in the 1930s, came up with a lot of places. The dictionary provided by Miles Beckwith and Ives Goddard was provided, half a dozen more places. And again, map work and missionary journals. If the missionaries wrote down, said, oh, the people, this, what we can do now is translate that back into the Munsee language and add it to our map. So here's an example of two places. Hoseswela means pots hanging out, and it's in the community of Dunville here in Ontario. I don't know why Dunville's called that, but I'm hoping to find some historical answer for that. More familiar to me, there's a small little community outside of our reserve called Middlemiss. And Middlemiss, while it doesn't seem like it would be all that important now, had a railway station back in the 1900s or in the 1800s as well. If you wanted to go to St. Thomas, which was a fairly big railway hub, or you wanted to go to Sarnia, you could hop a train there at Middlemiss. And yet, if that word didn't appear in the dictionary, I'm like, you know what? I'm sure people called it something. So Mittelemsung is the word for Middlemiss, and that came out of a dictionary courtesy of Miles and Ives. So it's wonderful to find these places, and of course, as I should say, all of these things are in flux. They're always available to to be questioned, to be revised, but most importantly, it's there to start those conversations about place. Important in my life right now is maple syrup. So I just finished today, lots of late nights, but it's a lot of fun. So maple syrup is another aspect that the river provides, where our people didn't actually stay in our village. We actually had another place where we went, but it wasn't too far away. But the missionaries wrote that when they tried to find us there, our village was empty, but that they found us later, but it wasn't like another page in the journal. So clearly we were fairly close. We probably used the river to get to our maple sugar camp. Some resources that came out of Six Nations identified the fact that we used the traditional religion, the big house ceremony, for recitations and prayer and dance during this time, as well as we played a hoop and pole game, where the winners got to serve taffy to the community. So those were some key pieces. Also, other historians have found some role differentiation that women would have actually potentially done, taking care of the sugaring camp while the men went hunting. And of course, that will need to be further researched. but it's sort of that indication in terms of role. This just came in this last week, so I was given a recipe. It was for mother's lax salve, and it was related to a Reverend Allen Salt in 1847 in Parry Sound, Ontario. But it was given to him by an old woman from Munsee. So here's where the connection with the plants that are along the Thames River comes into an actual medicinal usage. The writing's done in English, so the goal of the person who gave this to me, they want to translate this both into Anishinaabemowin, but they also want to translate it into Munsee to honor the person who gave the recipe. Interestingly enough, in some of these, in the relaying of this this recipe, there's an ingredient where you can only find in 3 places. 2 are in Ontario, 1 is in the United States. So there is one close to Parry Sound, which is 2 hours north of me on Georgian Bay. There's one place out Port Huron. So the Thames River clearly is important if you want to go get this one particular ingredient for mother's lax salve. You're going to have to travel all the way to Port Huron. So it's another one of those connections to the Thames River. So I think what I'll do is I'll stop there because we'll have questions. But I did want to thank a lot of people who are involved. I can't do this alone, and it's important to make those partnerships. And the people who are listed on this slide, I couldn't have done it without them. And the institutions that have supported me have been also very helpful. I do appreciate being able to have conversations and being given sort of, ideas and where I can go find information. And the APS and the team for APS has been one of those teams that have been very supportive. If you do need to reach out, if you want to reach out after the presentation, my email is listed. I'm fairly active on Twitter. I do manage the Munsee language Instagram and TikTok. I'm less involved with the TikTok because apparently my videos don't cut the teenage opinion in my house. But maybe I'll try and do better as I get more time. So, Kwatanishi Kwamawen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was really wonderful and wide-ranging, and I learned so much. I'm sure everyone else did too. We have a couple of questions already to go, and so I'll go with those first, and then if anyone else has questions, feel free to just say in raise your hand or type in the chat if you have a question, and then I'll put you in the order. Our first question is from Janet Medina. Janet, did you want to say it? Turn on your mic and say it directly.
No, that's okay. You can read it, Brian.
Okay, thank you. I will do that. So the question is, it's about Osage orange, and she's noting that Osage orange wood has been used as a dye, to use it like a yellow dye for a lot of places. Do you think it may have been used in dyeing in Munsee history and other folks?
That's, I mean, those are the key pieces. Those are the pieces that I'd love to follow up on. Here in Southwestern Ontario, there's documentation of Osage orange very sporadically. So I think there were probably specimens planted here, but there are a few. But that's that piece that if I travel if I get a chance to travel some of the rivers in New Jersey or Pennsylvania, then I'm gonna, be able to hunt those stories down. One piece that comes from our community is black walnut. So one of the elders shared with me that the black walnuts are made for dye. So you smash them and then they have that sort of that nice fall smell. And you got to wear gloves, otherwise you're going to stain your hands and it won't come off. So he related the fact that the black walnut was used for dye, at least in our community.
Yeah, black walnuts don't require a mordant usually to make the dye stick, whereas a lot of other things you have to use a tin or some other kind of thing to keep the dye to keep it color fast. But black walnuts, as you said, if you try to open the outer shell, your fingers turn black. It makes a great wood stain too.
Yeah, so he said. He said you got to wear gloves, otherwise you're just never going to get it off your hands.
Yeah, Well, where I used to use black walnuts, we used to run the car over them to break out the outer shell and then get to the inner shell.
Yeah.
But I have used them to dye wool, and it's very, very effective.
Oh, okay. Anishi.
Thank you for that, Janet. Agnes had a question next. Please go right ahead.
Good evening. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. This is really fascinating, and that you chose to use the river, which sounds so natural as a way of mobility and just everything revolving around the water system. So I wanted to ask about also the orange, well, the the fruit that the yellow, well, the white material that is inside turns yellow as it dries, right? And they used it for makeup and also as a glue to stick the arrows, the feather on the arrows. So that might be a way to spot maybe some translation somewhere. I thought about that, and I had also a question. Do you have a word for territory in your language? I was curious. And if I may, I have a third question because I was interested in the petroglyphs, you know, and there are a lot of petroglyphs that haven't been really, well, some of them are not completely translated, and some of them are meant to be seen when you are on the river. And I was wondering if you came across some of them on the Thames, or well, if that was something you considered.
The first question, territory, the closest word I can come up with is Aki, which is land or earth. That'd be the only, I think, the closest word that we have that's off the top of my head. The petroglyphs, because the river doesn't have, it goes through no hard rock, like no granite or things that would be permanent. There's no evidence that there's any sort of markings. Having said that, though, the river does have, and my former chief, who's passed on now, Mark Peters, he went on Google Maps and found aerial views of the Thames River. And what he found was there was some V patterns in rocks. And what the Munsee people have done, and I think other Indigenous peoples have done as well when it comes to rivers, is they create a fish vent out of those rocks. So he found a couple of potential examples of that. I haven't been able to back that up with any historical knowledge yet, but he did sort of allude to the fact that they did that on the Susquehanna River. And then as well, he believes that they did that on the Thames as well. So that's one of those sort of built structures, I guess, in lieu of not having petroglyphs, that that evidence might exist. To the east of me in near Peterborough, there are petroglyphs that the Anishinaabe people left, so that are quite nice. You can see them built right on the granite.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is one from Lisa Garrison. Lisa, would you like me to read it, or did you want to just read it directly? I'm happy to just do it directly. She said that if you could say something about how does Munsee Delaware differ from other Delaware languages, such as I know there's Unami is another one. Can you talk about how talk a bit about that? Tell us about that.
Sure. So there's the I just answered this question actually for work today. So the language, the Delaware language, or if you want to call it Lenape, has three distinct dialects. That's Unami, Munsee, and Alachtigo, I believe. So the Unami people majority of them live out in Oklahoma. And the majority of the Munsee people live in Ontario now, with a community in Stockbridge as well. So those are sort of the language speaking communities that I'm aware of. I can speak to Unami and Munsee because a lot of people reach out and go, hey, do you say hey in your language as like a greeting? Or like, no, so you must have been looking at that online dictionary that they put out in Oklahoma. There are some clear similarities in the language. If you were to speak Munsee, you could probably understand Unami as well. And in our communities here in Ontario, in Moraviantown, there's actually a bit of a blend of both Unami and Munsee. That sort of, I don't know if it honors, but it's part of that migration westward away from settlement, that the groups intermingled. And so within a community, you actually get people that are using words from both dialects. Our community is much different in that it's mostly a Munsee community, so there's not a lot of Unami presence. When I was back learning the language, I went back to the only first language speaker who's still alive, and she lives at Ravingstown. I said, "Kolamal Sija," which means, "How are you, my friend?" And she said, "That's not the way you say it." She said, "Kolamal Si Injo." And I was like, oh, and I went away all red-faced and then, oh, I totally got that wrong. And yet that's what I heard as a kid from our language speakers. And then years later, well, it was only 5 years later that 5 years from now, I picked up a book of someone who actually did some research at our community back in the 60s. And one of the expressions that was written down was Kolamal Sija. And according to that person, it's a dialect difference. It's a dialect difference between real old Munsee and Unami Munsee blend. And I was like, oh, so I wasn't wrong. It was like one of those, I finally got something right today, or for the year. It was a win for me. But having said that, Kolamal Sija and Kolamal and Jos are pretty close. So we can understand each other. The number pattern is a little different for Unami, but with some practice, I think I could totally understand it.
That's great. Thank you. I had just a quick question, kind of maybe tied to that, which was you're mentioning some of pointing to some of the other kind of printed older sources and so forth, and that some are, because of the writing used, it's kind of hard, takes a little to get through as to what they're trying to convey. Do the older printed sources or manuscript sources, like, is it, do you find that's easy to distinguish? Are there places where it's unclear which, whether it's supposed to be Munsee or Unami, or is it kind of contextually easy to figure out? Does that cause any issues?
You know what, it would, if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, I would say, you know what, I don't know. Now with more practice with the language and in translating stories and creating language resources, you can tell. Getting better at it with historical resources, going, yeah, this word just doesn't sound right. It doesn't sound like it's something that would be in the Munsee dialect. It might be Unami. So then, therefore, you can store that word for later and then come back to it if you want. But I am getting good at that, at least sniffing it out. Then, having to translate a linguist's term from the 1930s into a more modern use is another aspect of work for me. But it's fun. It's like mysteries, right? It's a discovery.
Makes sense. Thank you. Angelica is the next person with the question. Please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay. My question is the nature of language. The Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher of language, noted that the meaning of a word is in its use. And I was wondering if in the Munsee language, there is an evolution of sorts, so that when it was spoken 100 years ago, is different from the way it's understood or even spoken today. So I'm wondering about the evolutionary character of the language. the way we do in English, for instance?
Yeah, that's a challenge for us because of the gap of between first language speakers and the next generation. So here in Canada, a lot of the kids went to residential schools when it became law in 1921. And, since the Indian Act's creation in 1876, the use of Indigenous languages and in sort of a wider public space gradually became much smaller. And for a small group of people such as us after the revolution, there was 250 people that came across like 400 people that came across the Thames or at the Niagara River in 1779. Half them settled at Six Nations, half them settled at Munsee. Our community has always sort of historically hovered around 200. So while I believe, early on that tight-knit community would have spread that language, the pressures of not only the Chippewa, the Thames community, and marrying other communities, that maybe that inherent knowledge has sort of dissipated. And then, of course, when you have that last speaker die in 1990, I was exposed to first language speakers as a kid, but I think that meaning has sort of now, I guess it needs to be found again, is maybe the best way I can describe it, because you don't have that pool of elders, the people of that older generation who can speak it to pass on that knowledge. They might be able to share things in English, but that word meaning, how it may have translated over the years has now there's those gaps, right? Those gaps that are part of the trauma of colonization. That's not a great answer. I'm trying to think of a word as I'm speaking, going, okay, is there a word that from a long time ago? Here's one that I know that would have no context for the people on Munsee, Delaware. So Shawanpi means the ocean. So Shawanpi has no meaning for the Munsee people, or has maybe potentially little connection after they got pushed out of New Jersey and had to travel up the Susquehanna to try and find refuge. So there's a word that still exists. Do I understand the meaning of thousands of years? I don't, but it's one of those interesting words that still exist, despite the fact that our community is nowhere near the ocean anymore. So I apologize. I don't know if I answered your question to the best. It was more of a roundabout way.
No,
Hope it was
I
good.
think you did okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Because it's getting close to the hour. So Nathan, you had one question? Yes.
Yes. I apologize if this may have been answered already, but my question was considering the work of Zeisberger and his Indian dictionary with and the work of other Moravian missionaries and in that tumultuous period. I was wondering if at that time and like during the intervening centuries, did any of those individuals he was using as a source, or other members of the community, did they have the idea or the desire to create their own like journals, or try to write either in English or German or in their own Munsee language their thoughts and about their daily lives, like with the Cherokee community after they adopted the Sequoia syllabary, that they produced huge amounts of written material in the Cherokee script and Cherokee language, which obviously is a huge resource for the current revitalization efforts. I was just wondering if something similar had happened in like the various Lenape communities, difficult as that may have been, considering the centuries of dislocation and splinterization that happened.
Yeah, I can't speak for, because Zeisberger's the group of Munsee that he was attached to settled at Moraviantown. That's the other community. So I'm not sure whether there were people that did that. But for our community who were not Christian, and there's lots of missionary records trying to their very best to try and convert us. There's lots of evidence that we held on to the language and that traditional religion and culture a lot longer. So people from Moraviantown would come up to visit with relatives, but also to speak language, practice the culture, because Zeisberger writes about it, how he's disappointed that the flock have gone upriver and are getting into some of the old ways. But for our people, there were some people early on that could speak English that translated, like the example I gave in the slide deck of Charles Halfmoon, who translated the Anglican hymnal. There were a couple other people that added to that, leading up to about 1880, when they finally stopped with that type of work because they felt that most of the community would speak English anyway. So those are some clear-cut examples of where a community member actually wrote quite a lot in the Munsee language and then left it now for us to pick up and find we can use it for those missing words or missing pieces, or different ways of maybe honoring the Munsee dialect that was spoken at Munsee-town. So yeah, I can't answer for Moraviantown because I'm sure they do, but they would have to answer that one.
Well, thank you for that as well. And thank you everyone for your questions and for taking the time out of your day today. This was really wonderful and great presentation. I would definitely encourage everyone to follow Ian on the channels and social media. I follow his Twitter and it's great stuff. You get to see a lot of the day-to-day interesting work that he and his other folks are doing. And Ian, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and work that's going on in your community and other folks. And we all look forward to seeing continuation of the work in the future and to staying in touch.
Thank you so much.
Well, so we look forward to seeing everyone at future APS events. And in the meantime, we hope you and your family and friends are well, and take care in the meantime.
Lapit